more family time.
You can't get any more.
I can't, yeah, it's not possible to be more family time. My son-in-law, he can go out fishing without me a couple times, and I just let it go. Yeah.
Let's do, you want to do a microphone check and,
So mine says meeting should start in a few minutes. I don't have a review on it. What is this? What's wrong here? It says your meeting should start in a few seconds. He's got a view of everyone up on here.
Andrea, can you hear me okay?
Okay.
Somebody's speaker's on.
Mr. Bellman? Good. Check.
Hello.
And Heather is on via her phone, so you've got a full quorum.
All right. We'll call the meeting to order. Please rise and lead in the pledge of allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Yeah, click on the little.
You're there. Yeah, you're there.
You just gotta click on the camera.
We cannot hear Jamie.
Yeah, Jamie's on mute.
You're on mute, Jamie. Your microphone on your long mic.
All right. Well, that was intentional, so.
And somebody's got their speaker back on.
Yeah. All right. I think what I need to do is mute. Can you hear me now? No one can hear me?
I can.
You gotta be up.
Can you hear me now? There. All right. I'm seeing nodding heads. All right. First up is the personnel pack. Is there some introduction to this, Andrea?
I can certainly do that this time of year, especially I would say this year, there's a lot of changes, a lot of movements, whether it's change assignments or different positions or some exits, but then intakes to complete our staffing profile for the start of the year. That was the goal, and we're hopeful to be there at the start of this year. So this just helps us move things forward prior to September 1st.
Okay.
So it's just a typical personnel pack. Just be looking for a motion to approve the personnel pack as presented.
All right. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right. Motion by Bruce, second by Bob. Any
Mr.
further
President?
discussion?
Mr. President,
Yes.
just a quick question. Just looking at the exits, is this typical for this time of year to have this many exits?
Typical, I would say it's a little bit higher than our typical year. However, we do tend to have a lot of turnover, especially with our hourly staff, which I think the vast majority are the hourly staff. Some of them are the ones that we have discussed previously at the prior board meeting. But for the most part, yes, hourly staff, we tend to have a higher number in July and August resignations.
All right. Any further questions? Hearing none. All those in favor of the motion to approve signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, say nay. The ayes have it. Next up is fall athletics. And this looks like the 5 sports that we did not discuss or approve at the last meeting.
Yeah, and so really what it is, we said we would revisit this back on the 24th. And so I have Aaron on here. He's put together, basically our recommendation, administration's recommendation. what you see on the screen. I'll let him kind of walk you guys through it. And then any questions you have for him or for me, I'm more than happy to answer. So go ahead, Aaron Mullen.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if it's great to start, if there's more pressure to get done quicker, or if like last time at the end. But I'll take the time tonight. I know we talked about this topic 2 weeks ago, so I'll try and provide an update and skim over things that we've already covered. But beginning with objectives, the first two are the same. We're obviously continuing to try and provide extracurricular activities where we can, aligning with the HSD guiding principles. The new one would be the recommendation to continue planning and then beginning our schedules on September 7th for that second round of athletics. And then we'll go ahead and skip to slide 4. So we're looking at here, the WIA did issue return to fall sports considerations. I've highlighted in general what they cover. They're providing considerations for practices, which are pretty similar, a little bit looser in some areas than what we did in the summer. General considerations for events, the medical clearance form. That is a requirement before someone can return from a positive test. They do need to have a medical clearance form completed, signed by a physician, doctor before they can return to play. So we will run that through our school nurse office, our athletic trainer, and then through our athletic office to make sure that we handle that paperwork. And then the last piece would be the sport-specific guidelines for each sport. Within those, there's NFHS rule modifications that have been made to allow for specific things, such as masks, equipment considerations, competition considerations, officials, and what we want to do and provide for officials, and then coaches. All across the board, each sport, I believe the WA did a very good job in providing us with structure and direction to the schools on how to do this. I think everyone wants our kids to have opportunities, but how do we do that? I believe they gave us a starting point to be able to apply that at the local level. The HSD extracurricular reopening guidelines, we've continued to adapt and add to those. For our sports, we'd begin in a phase 2 for practices. Essentially what that allows us to do is begin progressing towards activities having fall competitions, which our first round of competitions for our sports that started August 17th would be this coming week. The first week was great. The kids did a great job. Coaches did a great job. A few tweaks here and there, but nothing major. It was very exciting to see the kids at their practices, in the facilities, out and having fun with their peers. I've also consulted with some local health professionals in Hudson physicians, our school nurses, and our athletic trainer, just in terms of reviewing these fall sports considerations and how it applies to Hudson and making sure that we're in line. Great conversations, support in terms of where we're going in terms of the WIA information, and then our extracurricular reopening plan. So that would wrap up our sport-specific guidelines. If we go to the next slide, being the school closure matrix. In our discussions, it's very important that extracurricular activities is an extension of the classroom. And, by saying that, we believe that we should be tied to this school closure matrix as well. Our proposal would be that if we're in person, that we could allow competitions with the mitigation strategies that we're going to put in place, but allow competitions localized. If we were to move to the level 2, we would continue low risk competitions. So the sports that started on August 17th, but our high risk sports, we would propose that we would move to practices only. And the reason we would move to practices only is we'd be removing the competition, which is more of our unpredictable, uncontrollable type of environment, where our practices, we have a little bit more control. We've seen success. We certainly do not want to part from the curricular aspect of school, and we do not want to move the needle in a direction that would cause us to close school by opening some of these activities. So we would want to follow this school closure matrix. If we were to get to level 3, we would suspend completely, including all practices. Hopefully we do not get there, but we would be there until we return to a level 2.
Aaron, can you,
Yeah.
this is Nick, can you also touch base on what, if we were to go to a level 2 and we go to practices only, it's not going to look like potentially what practices would look like in a level 1.
Right. Yep. So then that would go back to our reopening plan. And thanks for asking, Nick. We would go back to how we operated our practices in the summer. So it'd be physical distancing. There'd be very, very limited sharing of equipment. All of our guidelines that made summer successful is what we would implement in for our practices only should we get to level 2. So if we go
Thanks,
ahead
Aaron.
to middle school athletics. I'm sorry, local recommendations. Yep. Just to give you an idea of where we're at, I did link a fall return to play status. This is the same link as below. I think I duplicated it from With Sports. They're giving us a look at what schools are doing across the state. As you'll see, if you do click on that, it is a wide range of decisions. There are still some districts that haven't decided. If we look at our conference, prospective fall participation would include 6 out of 9 schools. So those schools listed there have said that we're trying to do everything we can to pursue fall athletics. 2 of 9, being the 2 Eau Claire schools, have completely moved their fall to spring. And one of our schools, so Superior's in our conference for football and girls soccer, has decided to move football and volleyball to spring. They do align with the Minnesota conference. And as you know, or may not know, Minnesota did switch football and volleyball only to spring and are trying to resume all other sports in the fall. So just a snapshot of what others are doing in the area. I do know the Middle Borders is still working through, but a majority of schools are also pursuing fall schedules. The first level of recommendations would be our middle school athletics. Our main goal with middle school would be to continue providing sports-specific opportunities for our students. We're proposing that we do an in-house fall sports-specific schedule at this time, and we can revisit when we start approaching winter. But one of the most limiting challenges we have for middle school is the scheduling, which is mostly relies on middle border. And as I'd mentioned, most schools, as I'd mentioned 2 weeks ago, most schools are doing a conference-only approach. We feel that we can do a great job in limiting our numbers by moving to an A and B schedule for our middle school. So we would do a 2 practice day schedule per sport. So if we looked at cross country, that's what it would look like. 6th graders would be there Monday and Tuesday. 7th and 8th graders would be there Thursday and Friday. Across all 3 sports, we're looking at not only continuing that skill development, but then we're getting into some type of competition option for them. So cross country would be conditioning games, in-house meets. We could potentially pursue what a virtual meet would look like with other schools. Football would not be our traditional football as we know it. We would not be using traditional equipment. We'd be limiting to football and footballs and flags and a 7-on-7 format. And volleyball, very similar. We would be doing an in-house league by grade. Our coaches would be there all 4 days. So what that would help us do is reduce the ratio and help us fit within the facilities that we have indoors for volleyball, but also limiting that and being able to spread out where we can in practice settings, which is also what we're trying to do at the high school level. Their season would be 6 weeks. So they start September 8th. We did begin registration. Registration numbers did spike right away on Monday. So that was exciting to see, or today, this morning, that was exciting to see. And then they would run through October 16th. So that'd be our middle school proposal. Do we want to work through one at a time, or do we want to move right to high school?
I think what we'll do is you present the whole proposal, and then I think what questions the board has, and then we'll kind of go from there.
Okay. So for high school, as we'd mentioned before, we're recommending that we move forward with our remaining fall schedules. That would include cheer and stunt, dance line, football, boys soccer, and volleyball. And I do want to clarify, cheer and stunt and dance line, they do practice in preparation for their winter, but they don't formally have any competitions until closer to the winter season. Because there are questions in terms of stunting and different routines for dance line. As I highlighted before, there are certain things that we're doing at the Hudson local level. But as a conference, we're trying to align as much as we can together, but that's difficult, as many of you can probably assume, with 7 different counties involved, 7 different district administrations and school boards. We're focused on a conference-only approach where possible. So we do have the ability, if we lose a conference opponent like Eau Claire, we would like to be able to schedule a local school, New Richmond, where it's limited travel. The exposure in terms of how many regions we're trying to reach across is very limited. Another thing the conference is aligning on is we are setting up the same opponents for the week. And by doing that, we're trying to, if there were to be a case, one, it's very easy for us to coordinate between ADs in terms of who could potentially be exposed, and helping us make decisions in terms of if we need to pause on something, if we need to reschedule, if we have positive tests coming in, we can communicate much easier and hopefully also mitigate any exposures that we may have. So football, volleyball, soccer, and tennis would be those opponents. So I know week 1 right now for our September 7th football would be the week of the 25th. That week we would be playing Menominee. So all 4 sports that I just mentioned would be participating in games against Menominee. For spectators, up to immediate family is what we're prepared to be able to accommodate. It's going to depend on opposing sites. As I mentioned, we're dealing with different counties. We will continue to follow county guidance in that aspect. I'll speak to how we would do that when I get to event management, but masks, we are going to be wearing masks indoors along with in accordance with the mask mandate, but outdoors when we cannot accomplish physical distancing. So essentially every sport will be wearing masks at all times except for potentially girls golf and swimming when they do enter the pool. We'll be wearing masks while we're transporting, transitioning, and so on. Again, with hopes to help mitigate the risk and stay in person as long as we can. Equipment, we will be disinfecting frequently. There will be no shared protective equipment. Disinfecting frequently, for example, our football team, we have 3 times a year, and we've done this in the past. So this is not new, but we use a company called Pro3, and they come in and disinfect the equipment. I have a link in my last slide for additional information. And it leaves a chemical on the equipment that lasts for 90 days and helps mitigate the risk and spread of bacteria and virus. Event management, we're going to increase signage as we have around the school, increase hand sanitizer, portable hand sanitizers, trying to accommodate distancing where we can, streamline admission. So what we're looking to do for our accommodated distancing, we went through each facility, mainly being the stadium, the pool, and the East Gym. We divided sections in half, and we're going to be labeling sections by number. So in the football stadium, we know that we can get 16 sections in. And what we're going to do is when somebody would arrive, they would get a number. They'd be in section 1A. Their immediate family would proceed to that section. And then we would skip a row. The next group would be in 3A, and we'd work our way up and spreading people out. Every other row, only 2 families per row on each section. And in measuring that out, we could accommodate the physical distancing required to do so. As a conference, we've talked about requiring masks and spectators, but there's been no definitive decision to do so. We would require masks on entry and in transition, but once they physically seat, we're still talking about what we would align on there. For streamlined admission, we're looking at handling that on the school level. So I would create passes and we would assign those passes to each family. The attendance would be for their individual sports. So we would not have JV volleyball parents able to watch the varsity volleyball game unless they had a daughter on each team. So we would be clearing facilities and trying to help reduce the amount of people inside the gym for volleyball. We're also looking at things in terms of scheduling that can help reduce that. Back to volleyball, for an example, our varsity and JV will be home on Tuesday against one school. Our freshmen and JV2 will travel to that school so that we can play back-to-back in a bigger gym. As you know, our West gym has much less seating, much less room. So we want to utilize that East gym for our games. So we're going to flip-flop. And then on the Thursday, our lower levels would come back here and our upper levels would go to the other site. Next would be concessions. We're proposing no concessions to start. If we were to see a positive trend, we would move to prepackaged goods, and that is highlighted in our reopening plan. Locker rooms, our goal is to establish, pretty consistent with what we tried to do across the lunchrooms, is 50% capacity with no personal items in the lockers. So football, for example, we would have their helmets here, their shoulder pads, and their pants. Everything else would go home with them, and we would be recommending more frequent washing of those materials by bringing those home. If it couldn't be daily, that'd certainly be understood, but much more frequently. And physical distancing. In conversations with coaches, we're looking at trying to physical distance in any way we possibly can. As I'd mentioned before, it is not reasonable to be able to physical distance during a football or soccer game. But on the sidelines, when we're in transitions, when we're setting up practice plans, as much as we possibly can, we're trying to mitigate risk. We are going to, like I'd mentioned, be wearing masks. We're going to be very cautious in terms of where we wear masks in order to continue to stay in person, as I'd mentioned. So with those things, we feel good about the plan that had worked in the summer, that's worked throughout this first week. These things are not easy, but our coaches and students have done a great job adapting and continuing to do what they can to make sure that we can stay in person and participate. So as I'd mentioned, there is another slide of additional resources for reference. There was a great study done by Dr. McGuine out of University of Wisconsin in terms of the impacts on mental health with not participating that was done this past spring. And then I also linked our Pro 3 solutions, disinfection and protection, if you wanted to reference what we're doing in terms of our disinfection of protective equipment. So that wraps up my presentation. What questions can I answer?
Mr. President?
Sue.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Aaron. And I know that we need to follow these rules and the work that you've done on how to handle the best mitigation plans, because largely we want to have, am I muted? Oh, I have to go up to my,
No, on your microphone. The button is up.
well, I thought it was up.
I can hear
It
you.
is up, right?
Okay.
Oh, okay.
So I can hear you.
I'm sorry. So I thanked you, Aaron. So if you missed that, I'll send you an email. But I mean, these plans are in place so that we can, in fact, have our children engaged in extracurricular activities. Now I've completely forgotten what I was going to ask about. No, I had a question about locker rooms. Locker room use is strictly for athletic programs, so they're not like generally available to staff to go and take a shower if they feel like doing something like that before they go home. Maybe that goes to Nick.
No, we typically do not have staff utilizing our student locker rooms for any reason.
We do have the 6 family style bathrooms that are in the building that have, they have a full shower, bathroom, change table, everything like that. So if staff need to shower for any reason during the day or before they go home, we would expect them to use those facilities that they can be locked and things like that.
But
And
students also have access to those
Absolutely.
independent use
Yep,
bathrooms.
any student can use
Yeah.
those, that if they don't feel comfortable in the regular locker rooms, they can absolutely utilize those for any reason.
Okay, Bruce?
Thanks, Aaron. This looks like a good plan. Just a couple of questions. Curious if we looked at just moving football and volleyball like Superior did to the fall, and if there was any rationale behind that or anything that makes sense for us, and if that was discussed.
You
So
mean
that's
move it to
question
the
one.
spring?
To the spring, sorry.
Yeah, we certainly discussed that as an option, and I would say it still can be an option. I guess what we're recommending is that we give it a shot and take as much time as we can. If we chose to say we were 3 weeks in and chose to move to that spring option, we could still do so. You can do that and make that decision up to 50% into the fall season.
Nice.
So if we got to that point and we saw either a spike in numbers or just weren't feeling great about the progression we were making by opening up these sports, we could make that decision still.
Okay.
We wanted
great.
to just give it what we could right now in the fall. We wanted to give it as best a shot as we could, knowing that the spring is uncertain as well.
Great. That's very good. And even better to know that. So thank you. Next question is just in regards to like video, right? Like I know we are networks out there, other networks that do a pretty good job at trying to just pipe the feed in for the different events. Are we looking at beefing that up, maybe asking parents to participate or do something there? I mean, people could certainly throw it on Facebook Live, but just curious if there's something that, we're planning on doing to try and make sure that we're allowing as much viewership as possible.
Yeah, if there's one thing we know, there's going to be people that aren't going to be able to attend that have attended before. So whether we allow spectators or not, we have 2 companies that have done streaming for us in the past. And I've been in constant conversation with them to try and obviously cover what they have covered in the past and reach down to lower levels if we have the capacity to do so, but also looking at how could we film a cross-country meet? How could we stream different events like swimming that we haven't previously? We are absolutely looking at ways to expose these events to people that are not going to be able to be there, that traditionally would be there to support these kids.
Bruce, you got your questions? Any other questions?
I think so, James.
Okay.
Thank you.
You got other questions?
No, I think I
Okay.
got it covered.
All right,
Thank
Rob, your hand's been up.
Thanks for hearing my question. So Aaron, again, I echo everybody else. Nice job. On slide 4, with the extracurricular reopening guidelines, there's a link. And maybe I just have an old version, but looking at the site-specific information, all of the sites everything there is crossed out. So that's my first question, and then I've got a follow-up.
Yeah, the site-specific information I am working through right now with the new release of the WI Sport Specific. And we did get some new information in terms of the county and numbers. So just working back through that list, I didn't want it to be a working document with some filled in and some not. So I just crossed them out for this time.
Okay, thanks. And this last question, Nick, maybe it's for you or for Tracy, but just I think in the same discussion or similar, the boosters and other youth organizations are going to be looking for space. Are they going to be following similar guidelines at the very young levels, or how do we envision that happening?
Well, one of the conversations that's kind of ongoing right now is, what is our numbers that we limit our spaces to? right now the St. Croix County ordinance, or not ordinance, it's a recommendation that they have is 10 inside, 50 outside. And that's really not related to spreading COVID. It has to do with contact tracing. And so part of the reason why schools, some people say, well, how are you going to have a lunchroom, or how are you going to have classrooms with more than 10, is the reason we're exempt from it because schools are exempt from it. But two, it's because we know who are in our rooms and it can help with contact tracing. And so one of the things that they've talked about is if we decide that we would want to open up those a little bit more, like if we wanted to say, right now we've kind of said about 10 to 12 people per court inside and 50 outside. There are certain guidelines they would have to follow to be able to ensure that they could tell us exactly who's there and who's a close contact as we work through it. So that's really the guidelines behind, or the rationale behind that 10 and 50. Now I know Eau Claire County just moved to, I think, 50 and 250, so 50 inside and 250 outside. Right now we had a call today with St. Croix Public Health. They're holding right now. Originally they said they were going to make a change, but I think Pierce County is not wanting to make a change. They're trying to stay somewhat consistent with Pierce County, but it's going to be one of those things where it'll probably be an ongoing discussion. But as of right now, our guidelines are still what we told you back when you opened the facilities in June, which is basically 10 to 12 per court and 50 outside. But we'll have further discussion. We may have a recommendation that comes to the board at the September meeting that may or may not continue down that path. It may come with opening them up a little bit more, but with more requirements on the folks that are renting our facilities.
Carrie.
Aaron, one question. I think you had said that the sports exempt from masks during competition were girls swimming and girls golf. Was cross country one that would need to wear a mask?
Yeah, good question. And they're kind of a hybrid. The proposal would be that cross country is wearing masks at all transitions. They would wear a mask until their 100-meter mark, which is a cone that's straight out from their start line. Once they pass that, they could drop their mask for the remainder of the race until they entered the finish line, and then they would put their mask on. And what we've done, when I speak to the sports specific guidelines, is we would create a chute for each school. Typically, if you've been to a cross country meet, there's one long chute. They walk through and they untie their shoes, they take off the chips and they hand those off. We would expedite that process back to where their school camp would be and spreading that process out. So cross country would wear masks at times, but not while they were out on the course and able to spread out.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, Heather.
Thanks, Aaron, for all your work on this. Quick question, middle school, did you say it's primarily space restrictions that are leading to the recommendation about the alternating practice schedules?
It was primarily scheduling. So with the middle borders being mainly who we were going to participate against, and River Falls has also decided to go in-house with their middle school. We really don't have a deep pool of people to even play against. So we decided to go down the road of controlling what we can control and continue to provide opportunities for our students. And without having a schedule, we wanted to try and develop it in a way where we could control that schedule and create more of an in-house atmosphere versus trying to play one game and then fit around the rest of the weeks in preparation for that one game.
Got it. And I guess I don't know that it's a question as much as a comment. I appreciate the insight about the flexibility about being able to shift plans up to halfway through the season. I guess my concern about that would be that if we're making a decision to shift, it may be that us using this approach has also brought more COVID to our school than would have otherwise been here. And we might be jeopardizing our ability to stay open academically because we've moved ahead with contact with these higher risk sports. So I know it's hard to lean toward a recommendation of pushing those sports to spring when it doesn't appear that we're going to have anybody or much of anybody to play against in the spring if other folks are opting for fall. But that certainly otherwise seems like a more prudent approach to still give those students a chance to compete, but to not do so right now when so much is up in the air.
Any other questions? Is there a motion? We could have one motion to approve both recommendations for both levels or split them.
Move to approve the recommendation as brought forth for the high school and middle school fall sports.
Second.
All right, motion by Bruce, second by Rob. Any further questions or concerns? Hearing no more discussion, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, say nay. All right, the ayes have it, and we will approve the sports schedule. Next up is discussion on the back-to-school blueprint and COVID-19 protocols.
Yeah, so really just an opportunity to kind of give you a heads up of where we are at and different things. Not going to go through the back to school blueprint. It has been updated, continues to get updated as more things become available to us. One of the things, it's a new document that is linked there is our back to school COVID-19 protocols. So a lot of those, it's kind of the fruit of a lot of those meetings we talked about. We had about 40 or 50 different work groups that were talking about what is going to be our protocols as we come back and expectations. So that's in that list. I'm not going to go through each one step by step. But essentially, this is more of a staff facing document typically. But everything from our general safety expectations, screening expectations, and where we landed, kind of some of the communication, and then even talks about some of the leave as it relates to staff and how that works. We also have in there, and that it just some of the stuff is redundant from what we have in the back to school blueprint, which is how we're going to communicate our cases. We also talked about face coverings, hand washing, and sanitizer. The physical distancing, kind of what our expectation is. We're well aware that we can't necessarily guarantee 6 feet of social distance space all the time, all day long. But what the expectations are going to be and what folks are going to be working on. Cleaning and disinfecting spaces. Teachers are going to be, just to touch on this one, and this has come up multiple times. So it'd be twice a day. Desks are going to be wiped down. Once in the middle of the day, and then once either at the very beginning or at the end of the day type of thing. So they get wiped down twice a day. We have all of the products and things we need for that. It's going to cut into the day a little bit. It's going to cut into either instructional time or planning time. We know that. But that's something we're working on. Talks about what we're doing with our ventilation, increasing our outside airflow. The meal schedules talks about some of those things, and the social distancing. It does have a copy of our school closure matrix in there. And then just some of the delivery models and distance learning, visual learning. It does highlight our special ed programming and different supports as it relates to school age care, field trips and events, large events, concerts. And I think it's something to note that, the large events, the concert events, we had a lot of conversations with staff specifically about this, whether it be the fall musical or concerts in general. And as of right now, felt because it would be hard, like, especially with some of our really large choirs, to try to get them into a space and still keep the kids spaced out. It would be very hard for us to have a concert type of environment. So some people might ask, why are you having sports and not having fall musical and concert? And that's the biggest reason. As we talked to the instructors, said this right now, they don't see it as being very practical to do it that way. When they are going to be singing in larger groups, will be the biggest they get to is about half their normal size. They'll be in the auditorium, but instead of being on the stage, they'll actually be out in the seats, spread out and socially distanced and working through some of those things. And so they'll be able to potentially concerts the second half of the year. We just to start with, we're going this direction. Yes, Bruce.
Just curious, since these kids are going to be together, practicing together, could we potentially do a concert where it's just televised and nobody participates, but and they maybe even do smaller groups, but it's again just those kids that have already been together, practicing together, and you just have video?
Yeah, and I think that's something that the music staff is looking at. What's feasible? I think the other part of the concert experience, the performance experience, is creating a performance experience. And depending on how much you have to space people out, depending on if you're making them wear masks, what is the quality, and is it is it worth doing it at that level? But absolutely, because we talked about doing concerts that were just completely streamed online, live streamed. We've talked about even doing that with the fall musical, but as of right now, at least through the conversations we had, the comfort level wasn't quite there. And so, but it's something we'll revisit. And it could mean that there may be some opportunities for smaller ensembles to do some things virtually and things like that. But it's just going to look very different as we work through some of those.
We could do some cardboard cutouts of parents and get them in the seats and pipe in some clapping, right?
There'd be all kinds of different things, but I mean it's definitely something we want to figure out. How can we maintain experiences for kids, because that's what we've been trying to do all the way through.
I appreciate you looking into it. Thank you.
Yep. Field trips, around there, you can see we're reducing field trips. Visitors and volunteers, I mean, this is a big one. We've talked about this in the back school blueprint, but really the non-essential visitors and volunteers. I know we've had some requests from different groups to come in and even wish our kids well on the first couple of days, things like that. We've kind of said, hey, although we really appreciate that, we want to try to keep as many essential visitors off campus to the best of our ability as we work through things. And then you can see the documents. But I think so. This is a kind of an encompassing document, and then Andrew's going to be speaking to in a minute some of the other documents that we've put out. A couple other things I want to kind of touch on as we work through this is I've been doing district-wide Zooms with anybody that wanted to join staff-wide. They average anywhere from, I think the largest we've had is just over 100 staff members that have been on, and we've I think last Fridays we had close to 80 on there. So we've had kind of a variety of them, and now they kind of subside because we're back. We start this week. We have staff back in the buildings and we're working, but I'll be doing building listening sessions in the buildings and getting out into the buildings and making sure can listen and hear what's going on. But it's been a great opportunity for people to ask questions and it's been a good dialogue. So really have appreciated that. One of the things that we did not put in the handbook, but something that we've been kicking around, and this is somewhat COVID related, is, and you say this seems kind of off and it's not up for approval tonight, but we just wanted to kind of give you guys a heads up is, right now, I believe when people can sell back a personal day at the end of the year, I think, is it one, Andrea, they can sell back? Yep. Okay. They can sell back. And I believe they can sell back for $50 a day. Is that right?
Yeah.
And so one of the things is we start to look at how do you staff your buildings? How do we do some of these different things is since we raised the sub rate to $200 a day, and really we're worried about staffing is probably our number one obstacle as it relates to keeping schools open, is, we would probably like to bring to the board in September a recommendation that we would raise that personal day buyback to just what we're paying subs, so that, because if we're going to have to pay that money out anyway and not have our teacher in the building with us, we'd rather have the teacher in the building and we're going to pay the money out if they want that. And it's not that they would have to do that, but so it'd be that we would, because even though it's a $200 a day sub cost, when you add in FICA and WRS and any of the other auxiliary things, really between $230, $250 a day. And so is what a sub cost is. And so that's one of the things that's going to be coming up as an effort to try to, I don't want to say curb personal day use, but if people choose not to use them, there's a little bit more benefit for the individual not using them than just the $50 a day, since we're already going to be paying out if they do use them. So it's basically it would be a wash, I think, financially for us is what we'd be looking at. But we think that it's obviously better to have our teachers in the classrooms, and it would put less strain on our sub pool and things like that. So any questions or thoughts on that? So I'm just kind of bouncing all over, and I'm gonna have Dave. Do you want to give an update on our parent survey and how many folks we have in and where we're trending as far as who's selecting face-to-face instruction?
Sure, yeah, you bet. We just got an update just about an hour ago. So we are at a total of 4,930 responses right now. So we're getting close. We're around in the corner here, the final stretch. We're tracking about 85% opting for on-site in-person regular instruction. And our other is the number that's decreasing. At one point, we were tracking about 6%. We're in the other category. That's down to about 2%, which means that families are making decisions and finalizing their plans as well. Principals have been doing a great job making all these calls. We're to the point now where we're not sending out district-based reminders. They're coming from the principals with the link, because we're now trying to get those last few folks that have not yet completed the survey to do so. Even if we have the information, we actually want them to complete the survey, because we also gather our technology information on here to determine if they need a Chromebook or they might need a hotspot. For your information, so you know that we're tracking 135 families right now that are indicating they need a hotspot, and about 450 requests for Chromebooks. So right now that works, where we've got the supply to handle that. And just on a totally separate note, we ordered our cameras for our individual distance learning. Half are in and half will be in Friday. So we'll be all ready to roll for that as well.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Heather.
Thanks, Dave. Do you have a sense of those 15%, what kind of an impact we're going to see on homeschool families?
So yeah, we have some families that have indicated they are interested in homeschooling that haven't before. A slight uptick. I wouldn't say a real significant uptick, but a slight uptick. Obviously, families are looking for the best solution that fits their needs, whether that's a fully virtual option in another district or homeschool. But very happy with the fact that the vast majority of our families are finding that our individual distance learning or on-site model meet their needs.
Okay, all right, Bob?
I was just wondering, are we confident that with 80% of students choosing in-person learning, that we can social distance safely in cafeterias, buses, classrooms? Is that kind of what we were expecting, was that 80%?
Yeah, we were anticipating anywhere from 80 to 90% of our kids being back. Our cafeterias will be able to operate at 50% capacity, so we can space out. Plus, we have bought plastic dividers, so kids aren't, when they are having their mask off, there's a plastic plexiglass. You'll see that coming up in Tim's budget slides. We spent over $250,000 with dividers and trying to make sure that we're in areas where we can't get good distance between kids. We have some type of physical barrier. Classrooms, it could be, it's really hit or miss. I mean, some classrooms will easily be able to space out and other classrooms not as much. And as we've said, we've never promised parents all the way through this that we can guarantee them 6 feet all the time. And we, the hallways and passing time and things like that, both the high school and the middle school have taken steps to try to change traffic patterns. There's been markings on floors. They're going to be going over this with kids when they arrive the very first day. Get a lot of some of our most busy hallways are going to become one-way traffic, so we don't have that face-to-face interaction and congestion. Middle school is a little bit easier to let out at different times because they can do it by houses or by grade levels, so that they can minimize the congestion in the hallways. But so we're working through that. But this is about where we anticipated. Right about where we would be. It was interesting. I talked to the Bill Foster, I think, from School Perceptions, who has done surveying for us, and they've done a bunch of back to school surveys for districts around the state. And it's been between 80 and 85% almost across the board, across the whole state, of people wanting to send their kids back face to face. Now, not necessarily that everybody's going with that, but as they've surveyed parents and the parent surveys that have gone back. So we seem to be right in line with probably the way the majority of folks are. Yep.
Heather?
Nick, can you talk a little bit about, you just referenced surveys, how we're going to get feedback about how this actually rolls out? I mean, I think, I have no doubt that our teachers and our families are going to give it their best. And yet this is a really new way to deliver instruction, a really new way to learn, having this, this synchronous, both in person and so how are we going to get feedback from teachers, from families, from students, so that we have a sense, obviously not after the first week, because I'm sure the first week is going to be chaotic, but how are we going to collect that feedback from folks so we can make good decisions moving forward?
Well, I think even that first week we'll want to get that feedback, because if there's things we can iron out. I know that's something Dave and his team is working on, as they're constantly getting feedback from teachers and the leads. So we will probably be sending out more surveys to people, asking them what, how things are going. and making tweaks and adjustments. I mean, one of the things that people have to understand is it will not be flawless. I mean, it will not probably be smooth all the time. It will be kind of, you know, a little bit ugly at times and things like that until we kind of work through it. But, you know, I think that's where the expectations just people have to keep their expectations somewhat in check to start as we continue to work through it. But yeah, there will be opportunities for people to provide us feedback. Not only folks that are doing the distance learning, but we'll also be looking for feedback from parents who are sending their kids face to face and feedback with buses and things like that. So there may be a lot of surveying going on this fall, you know, and one of the things that we'll try to do with surveys, it's not that we don't like to have open-ended comment portions on the survey. I mean, it's good, but if all of a sudden you get 3,000 paragraphs of open-ended comments, it's hard to get through it and get a lot of feedback. So we try to get into a choice model so that we can, you know, do something to quantify the data so we can look, okay, here's a theme or here's a trend or something like that. We'll still give those options, but that's one of the big challenges that we run into with some of those things. But yeah, there will be lots of opportunity for feedback. I don't know, Dave, if you had anything specifically planned as far as with teachers on a regular basis.
Yeah, Lisa and Ivy have talked about that quite a bit with me, just how we'll be checking in regularly with the leadership groups that we've identified. So that would be the committees representing each curricular area at the elementary level, our PLC leads at the middle school, and then our department heads at the high school. So some more regular check-ins from teaching and learning just to make sure that we know what adjustments we need to make. One thing that's going to help tremendously versus what we went through last spring is we'll be getting some real-time feedback. It's hard to know how things are going if it's asynchronous because you're not connected directly with student and family. Once you become synchronous, it's much easier to learn what's working and what's not working because you can see it on their face. So we'll be able to be a little bit more nimble with our adjustments, but we'll still need to be able to reach out and get that formal information and feedback.
So, and I guess I would just, I mean, as much as, you know, we as a board can chime in and we've got some formal structures to provide feedback, I think important to make
Yeah.
sure, and it
Oh,
sounds like we
absolutely.
are, to get feedback directly from classroom teachers, to get feedback directly from parents. And I think, you know, we've shared this metric, which sends a signal that, you know, if numbers change with COVID, there's a change that we might have to
Yep.
change our plans. My assumption is there's also a chance that we will figure out that this model that we've developed isn't working and we have to pivot to something else. I mean, so I think that just so that families know that we're looking, that the staff and the leadership is really looking at all aspects of this and not just the COVID numbers to help guide decisions moving forward about how we deliver our education this year.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. I mean, and we've talked about it as a leadership team. I mean, we're putting together what we think is our best plan going forward, but there's 5,700 variables that kind of come into play here, and we won't quite know until we get it up and running. But yeah, we may have to adjust our model. We may have to, but I think the thing is, what we want to make sure that people understand is we don't want to have, let's say, maybe a less than desirable day 1 and day 2, and all of a sudden say we need to adjust our model on day 3. I mean, I think, you know, we want to try to give it some time to see how it works its way out, to see if it does get a little bit better. And I'm not saying give it a whole semester or anything like that, but we want to be able to give it enough time to find out, okay, is this just kind of the newness of it, and still letting people know that, yes, we're being responsive, but we you know, we have to see how this rolls out, and then we'll make adjustments and tweaks along the way. Absolutely. Sue had a question.
Boy, you're reading my mind.
Yeah.
Amazing. So just to comment on that, yeah, I think we need to give our model enough time before we change horses in the middle of the stream, so to speak. If we did change our model, then it would necessitate us completely relooking at our guiding principles, which are rooted in a lot of data that we're working from. And we're also referencing constantly what's from the CDC and public health. So backtracking, we don't want to just trip off of our plan with any, you know, quickness here, because I think we have a good plan.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think, you know, both you and Heather's point, I think that the best thing we can do is collect data and make our decisions based on the data as a whole versus people that just want to push a direction or another direction. I mean, we really want to make sure that if we're going to make tweaks or adjustments or things like that, we're basing them on data versus, hey, I read this article, or hey, I did this, or hey, I heard about that, or the news media is really covering certain things. I mean, we've talked about this. I would say that the likelihood of the news media covering a lot of negative school related stuff over the next few weeks is probably pretty darn high. And it's going to be hard to put into context how that is, related to the number of successful potential school openings. And so we do know that there are a ton of colleges that have started back. And we know we're hearing a lot of the colleges that it's not going well, but we're not hearing much about the colleges that are. And so I think that's where it's going to be important for us to utilize our data, to utilize our metrics, to make sure that we're getting what we need and making those decisions. And it is a big ship. And I think that's the other piece people have to understand. I mean, this is not a real small organization. It for us to change things, that's why even like with the 2-day lag on stuff, unless it's an absolute emergency that we need to close, it's a big shift for parents. It's a big shift for staff. It's a big shift for students. And so, we're trying to always look out on the horizon, but really trying to make sure that we're monitoring those things. But I think those are great points. So as that kind of leads into kind of my next section, which is the St. Croix County numbers. If you've had an opportunity to look, and I had sent you an email last week, they have been trending in a pretty good direction for us. There was a pretty big day on Saturday. We had our call today. They had 18 cases on Saturday. However, that was had 2 cases then today. And so it's or maybe I'm sorry, on Sunday. So it ebb and flows. And so we just try to count back basically the 14 days. And the data that we're using is the one on the DHS's website that every Wednesday, the DHS has said, this is what by 2:00 on Wednesdays, we're putting this out. It doesn't mean that we're not tracking this data on a daily basis. It doesn't mean that we're not constantly in communication with St. Croix County, but as far as for putting, utilizing our school closure matrix, we're using the DHS data on their website. And so, but we are trending in a pretty good spot other than maybe the last 2 days. We've had our last couple of days over the weekend. We had some big bumps. When we had our call today, the biggest increase right now, that's resulting in our biggest lumps are coming from the 20 to 30 year olds, as we've talked about. And then also 40 to 49 year olds. They're seeing some cases, obviously 0 to 19, but it's not growing like some of those other ones. And so it's just, that's what we're checking and always making sure that, we're not doing things that are making it worse, and that we're trying to adjust and things along those lines. We had a great call with public health today, this morning with local public health, talking about, they really want to see us try to stay open as best we can, unless it gets to a point where we're not able to staff. And because I think they definitely recognize that this, obviously, yes, this is a COVID situation, but there are so many other external factors that have to weigh in on these decisions other than just COVID. And so it is a balancing act as we go through it. We did have an interesting conversation today and this afternoon. We had another call with the statewide DHS with Dr. Westergaard and then the head administrator for the state DHS. And I would say that, administrators across the state are pretty frustrated because everybody's having to come up with their own school closure matrix because the state chose to not come up with a statewide standard matrix that says, do this, do this, do this. And after they told us they were going to come up with that. And so I think that was the first time we had that group on with statewide superintendents. I think they heard loud and clear that people are pretty disappointed. It's hard. I think that the thing was, it was hard to sit there and say, we want to take what you guys say seriously, yet you don't come up with the matrix that we need in order to determine should we be open, not be open. And Minnesota has theirs and Illinois has theirs and Iowa has theirs, and they're all different, but at least they came up with some things. And so there's a level of frustration there. But as of right now, I mean, things are going pretty well in St. Croix County. I think it's just something we're going to constantly monitor. If you notice, the hospitalizations have dropped drastically. If you go to their dashboard, right now on their dashboard, they have only one person currently in St. Croix County that is being hospitalized related to COVID at this time, and nobody outside of the county. So it's not a county resident being hospitalized outside of the county. So we're at 599 cases as of right now. They're saying, of which 457 are recovered, and so testing, I believe, is getting better. The times are getting shorter. I had to go in myself for a COVID test on Friday. Actually, I went in because I had a sinus infection, but they said, well, since you had symptoms that related to similar symptoms, we have to test you for COVID. And I will tell you, it is less than a pleasant experience, I guess would be my opinion of it. But it was great. I got my negative results back this morning, so that's why I'm able to be here with you guys today. So that's a turnaround of less than 3 days, and that's over the weekend. So I thought that was quite impressive, and that worked out quite well. So again, that's kind of what we're hearing from St. Croix County and the numbers and everything else that we have going on. I want to have Tracy just kind of talk a little bit about our employee childcare setup and where she's at with everything.
Certainly. So at the last meeting, you had agreed to allow employees to utilize our school age care program. So we had 70 employees who are currently requesting childcare. We only have 3 families or 3 employees who will be using childcare when we start September 1. About half of the employees who have requested care are Hudson School District residents, so they would be impacted depending on our circumstances. Thanks to Kim Osterhuse at Willow River, we'll be using that school as our first employee childcare site. So we're all set to go and are connecting with the families who need care right away, so that we're making sure that we're providing the connections kids will need for their own learning in their own school districts.
So and just as a reminder, because I know we did this at a special meeting, obviously the benefit of having this for employees at a subsidized rate is it allows us to have our employees still here working, teaching our kids. Like I said, staffing is a big deal for us, and that's what we think is probably our biggest Achilles heel. And so things that we can do to try to mitigate the risk to staffing and things like that, we want to do. So Tracy's done a great job getting that up and running. And Tracy, you said there's 70 people that said they would need it if their child school closed potentially, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Not 70 right off the get-go.
Nope. We only have 3 families to start with. And then some will start, because Minnesota schools are starting at different times. So we'll have some joining us further into the month.
Okay. Thanks, Tracy. And now I just kind of want to close out the update with Andrea. She's going to kind of talk a little bit about what we have going on in HR and some of the other documents on the agenda.
Okay, so I linked a few documents. These documents were sent out to staff today. And we shared up on Friday afternoon with the new teachers came on Friday morning, and then with the Zoom call at Friday at 10 as well. So the first document is kind of like I call it a quasi FAQ, quasi flowchart regarding COVID, because we kept getting similar questions over and over. And so trying to put it into like a, what if this happens, what happens next? And what if that happens, what happens next? And so I thought it was a pretty, Tracy shared this program with me. And so created this. So we have our symptomatic scenario, and I won't go through all the details, but the symptomatic scenario, we have the asymptomatic scenario, then we have what happens if you go into quarantine. And then what do you do? What other types of leaves exist in the event that you are subject to a COVID related issue? And then also a childcare one. And so you can see we try to make it pretty straightforward. We tried to balance, making sure that they got the information with also trying to encourage people to come back to HR and ask the specific questions as well. So that's that first document. It's really, again, just a high level summary hopefully in a user-friendly format. I've gotten some good feedback from staff. So this is kind of that initial entree into the COVID issues. And then the other two documents, the first one is temporary leave options during COVID-19. And that spells out more the meat behind FFCRA, as well as just reminding people that we have all these other types of leave that continue as usual in our handbook. But above and beyond that, then we have the COVID leave. We have the emergency paid sick leave. We have the Extended Family Medical Leave Act, which is the EFMLA. And then we have the potential temporary virtual options. So laying that out, what that looks like in some scenarios as well. Again, the goal is to be transparent, give information to staff, and then problem solve as issues arise post September 1st. The last document is the temporary remote teaching expectations document. And this was one that we worked with our council on to clarify. Oh, that's not the right one, Tim. To clarify what teachers who are able to work remotely, what they can expect or what we should expect out of them, so that we can be on the same page. So that, you know, whether it's, you know, timeliness of responding to emails of staff or students, or, you know, broadband capacity, stuff like that. So try to lay out some of that, again, to make sure that there's not misunderstandings and that we can all be on the same page as we're heading down this challenging new road. So that was a real quick summary of the different documents. Any questions for me?
Board members have any questions regarding the
Just
personnel?
so Andrea, a lot of what you just shared with us has been communicated with the various principals, because they'll probably be the first people to hear these questions from their teachers.
Definitely. I mean, I think they're probably tired of me talking about COVID, but I mean, it's starting back in March and April when all of it began. And then with our retreat or multiple retreats, we walked through these documents, even with the document, the first one that I just worked on last week, emailed out to them for their feedback. Very good response, because I think it does help them if they can say, here's a document that answers some of your questions. If it's beyond this, contact HR and then we'll work collaboratively through it, which was also the message as I sent it out to staff today, is that transparent, open communication as we're going through this will make it much easier.
Any other questions regarding any of the 3 documents that Andrea had prepared?
And that's the update.
Okay. Very good. Thank you for the update. I think we're moving in a good direction.
Nice
Now
job.
next up, strategic plan.
So this is a document that you guys saw. It's been about 6-7 months. We were reviewing it, and then school closure happened, and then we kind of put it on the back burner a little bit. And so this is the culmination of the work with Hudson Lead, the focus groups, and working with Studer Education is coming up with our overall strategic plan for 2020 to 2025. It's a 5-year strategic plan and where we want to focus. We've gone through this, we've talked about it, but we wanted to give people a little bit more time with it and then see if you guys are still thinking we're in the right direction. And if so, then, you know, it would get put into final form and then approved, you know, formal approval would be at the September board meeting. So any questions I can answer on it or anything specific? I know Sue, you had sent me a question.
Well, I sent a lengthy email to the cabinet on this. So I guess I want to know a little bit. I think this is something that you can discuss among yourselves, not necessarily tonight, but I asked questions about, well, I should get my notes up here, I guess. Here they are. I asked questions about just what we mean by inclusive, and I sent some definitions for inclusion and equity and diversity, because I think sometimes, well, maybe that's just me, but it seems like we interchange them quite a bit. And there are institutions, including the Phipps Center for the Arts right now is working on an inclusion statement. And so, and I know we say supportive and inclusive learning environment, but it might be valuable for us to really understand what we mean by that term. And I bantered it around when we were talking about the LGBTQ thing, which I think got greatly clarified and elucidated by the Yarbus report that seemed, I think, to really shape it and give clarification. But I just think it would be nice as we're using that expression all on the same page to all be on the same page.
Mr. President.
Yes, Rob.
And so, Nick, I appreciate the pillars. One of the problems I had with the last strategic plan was that there wasn't a whole lot of strategy that supported what would have been our pillars then, which then would be supported by specific tactics that are measurable, quantifiable from a results standpoint. I know we have our scorecard, but ultimately, how does this become supported, and how do we know that we're making progress?
Yeah, absolutely. And so what we've been working on then with Studer, the second phase of this is after this is kind of the larger umbrella, kind of direction for the next 5 years. Then what we're working with Studer on is how do you operationalize it, and how do you measure it? How do you quantify it? How do you know if you're doing it? And so that's their kind of version of a scorecard where it puts in those very specific action items. Who's responsible? What are the timelines, 30, 60, 90-day plans, and all those pieces. So that's really this next step is operationalizing this overall strategic plan. And at the very, at all the different levels, at the building level, department levels, district level, as you work through it. The full district scorecard still kind of lays over top of everything because it falls into all of these areas. We have different measures to measure these on the district scorecard, but it's the action planning piece is what's coming up next after this gets approved. That's probably more of the that's why it's called the action plan. It's the actionable stuff that we're going to be doing to implement this plan. So
what's the timing on that, Nick?
We've already started working on that. So we've already started going through what does that look like, and I believe we're going to be working on that coming up in October. Gail will be back to work with our team from Studer, and the thing the feedback we got from the leadership team was not that this is not important; it is very important. But right now, everybody's hands are really full trying to see if we can get the school year off to a good start. So October felt like a pretty good landing point to bring it all back and have everybody be a part of it and start to continue to build on that work.
Thanks.
Yep.
Yes, Heather.
Yeah, so no, I think this is great. I think the one thing I would encourage as we move ahead is, so how do we differentiate our district? When I look at this, I think just about any district in the state could look at this and say, yep, this is what we're about. Our last strategic plan was really, I think, visionary in that it really called out some ways that we were saying, this is what we're about at Hudson. And maybe it was or wasn't the right things, but I think it was that hook that we were saying, hey, this is what we're about, and maybe a little different. That I think entrepreneurial learning was something we called out. We really focused, I think, on collaboration, environmental stewardship, in HSD 2025. And so I think, and maybe that's some of the work that we can do is, are there pieces of this that we pull out that really are the things that we say, and this is something that we actually focus on more than other districts that makes us unique and makes us who we are. Because I think this is all really good stuff, but none of it jumps out at me as like, this is our differentiator.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was a big part of the conversation we had with the Studer Group was, okay, when they started to look at things that we already had in place, it was, they were more action plans than an overall strategic plan. And so one of the things that is going to be happening is it's going to be much more specific, as you talked about. Some of the things that were in HSD 2025 are more action plan type things than necessarily a overall strategic plan. And so this is supposed to guide where we want to put our energy, how it's going to tie back, so that as we are having discussions at the board level, at the administrative level, at the building level, how does whatever it is that we're working on tie back? Where does it fit into this plan? And then as we create those action plans for this, we'll be able to share and say, hey, this is how we're basically operationalizing or bringing to life, engaging in meaningful partnerships between families and the district. What does that actually look like? And so, and that's where we kind of take that charge and report back to the board, and then also get that information out to our parents and our other stakeholders in the community. So it will, this is, and for me, I kind of felt it was very general too. That was one of the big reasons why I pushed very hard 3 years ago to go with a scorecard, because a lot of times mission statements, strategic plans, things like that, they look like they could be applied to just about any district across the state, because everybody's hopefully trying to get to somewhat of the same ends. But the big thing is how do you know if you're doing it? And is your district doing it well? And I think that's where our scorecards and that's where our action plans come into place, to be able to say, this is what we're doing and this is how we know we're doing it well. And it ties back to these pieces. So it's going to continue to build over the course of the year, and you're going to see a lot more detail as it relates to kind of things that are connected to this. But at least from what we were looking at in other high performing districts, Kettle Moraine, or even like Chippewa Falls that was using them, or we saw stuff with Howard Swamco. I mean, their goal was to have a 1-page snapshot strategic plan, and then you have the other supporting documents that come into play.
Okay. Any other questions about the strategic plan then? Yes.
May I
Sue.
make one more comment? And again, this is something that I did email, because I know the staff likes to hear things ahead of time if you can. Under the team, we've done a lot of work this last year in talking about the culture of administration, administrative teams, and administrative leadership, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm hoping that looking at the culture of leadership can maybe be integrated into one of these items that can also become something that we measure. And I don't know if it's the reward one, recognition and reward. And certainly recognition and reward is something we do very well when we are allowed to gather and recognize those that are retiring, et cetera, et cetera. But that kind of thing is something I think we've come to understand is ongoing and pervasive up and down, the hierarchy or the chain of command and so on. So I'm hoping that all of you that are working more intensely on the strategic plan would give my words some thought. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? All right. So as you said, that you'd get back at it in October and probably report back to the board on the development of the action plan, because this is the strategic plan.
This would be the overall strategic plan. And then what we'll be reporting back to the board, later this year would be the actual actionable steps, to operationalize this. But this would come back to the board probably in September to say, okay, are you comfortable with this direction, general direction, knowing that the actionable steps are coming next? So, because we need the overall direction set, so then we can start getting more into the details or into the weeds as it relates to each of these things, so that, we don't start heading down a path and then people say, yeah, we didn't want to go down that path at all. And then we got to yank people back.
So what you're looking for is board members to review this and just say if they see something that they don't agree with and shouldn't be part of the strategic plan, or if there's something large that we're missing.
Yeah, just let me know. And otherwise you could probably plan on seeing this at your meeting on for a formal approval in September.
Can you consider what I sent to you in the mail as my contribution?
You bet. Absolutely.
Okay. Then next up is the back to school in-service update.
So I'm going to touch on this a little bit and then turn it over to Dave to touch on it. I mean, our back to school looks a little different this year. Usually we try to really do a school community celebration, as far as try to bring all of our staff together. We try to, have it be a really a fun event. Obviously, bringing 800 employees into the auditorium is not advised at this point. So we're going to be breaking up those events instead of having, the staff lunch or the staff breakfast that we've had in different years. We're going to have events in each of the buildings, and we've kind of spaced them out. And the cabin team and myself will get to each of those and have events in each of the buildings. And we also have a short video, I think, that that Tracy shared with you guys, that will be playing at that event as well, is kind of thank yous from people in the community as we kind of work through some of those things. But Dave, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about kind of what we typically do for the instructional meetings and things like that, and how that's changing as we are preparing for this coming year.
Yep, you bet. Thank you. Yeah, so quite a few changes, as Nick said, and everything we typically plan was sort of turned on its head, and we had to take a new, fresh look. So Andrea and her team in HR planned a fantastic Friday. So it was our first day with our brand new teachers, which is always an exciting time just to see all the new faces and the excitement and all the energy coming to the building. And we started something a few years ago that I think had even more meaning this year. We planned that day for the mentors or the building orientation buddies, and every new teacher has at least one of those folks associated with them. They met together for our luncheon, and it was a fabulous time, even though it was very different. Big thank you to the Chamber of Commerce, because they typically sponsor this event and provide the food. It was a little bit different, but they still sponsored the event. A lot of local businesses gave some swag for new teachers, but it was a very positive event, and it was a great way to kick off the year, but very different from what we would typically do. And then from a professional development standpoint, things were very different as well. If you remember when we approved the calendar for this year, and this was all pre-COVID, but we made the decision to move one of the PD days from October to the beginning of the year in August. So we had 4 days for all teachers, veteran teachers, to work on the various professional learning activities that we do at the beginning of the year. That turned out to be really fortunate for us to have that additional day at the beginning of the year with everything being so new. So what we tried to do was maximize individual teacher planning or planning with the PLCs. So if it wasn't absolutely essential to be delivered either from the district level or even from the building level, we said, let's put it off and give teachers as much time as they can have. Having said that, we still needed a lot of time with them just to get ready for all the things related to COVID that are different. Teaching in this individual distance learning environment is different no matter what. Even if you don't have a student necessarily in your class that signed up for individual distance learning, things are still going to look different from day one, because we need to be ready in case we have to flip that switch at any point. So teachers have done a great job of digging in, learning, asking good questions, and then helping refine our plan to make sure that it makes the most sense as it possibly can. As Nick said earlier, there will still be bumps in the road. We know that, and we'll be as flexible as we can with everyone as we work through those details. So if you look on the schedule that went out with the letter that Nick sent out to all staff members, you'll see things like individual work time in the classroom or PLC meetings. In fact, that additional day that was PD typically in October is all essentially teacher work time, whether they're working with the professional learning community or working individually. And that holds throughout for the rest of the time that we have with all staff. And I think they appreciate it. There's never enough time. We could have 10 days at the beginning of the year and we'd still be looking for more time for professional learning. And the same thing with, throughout the school year, there's always more that we want to do. So we were very judicious in our thought process, making sure that if it wasn't essential, we moved it off and delayed it. Any questions on the schedule?
I just wanted to say, David, that I commend you on this, being an old teacher myself and having to be dragged out of my classroom to go to meetings when I really had so much to do. So I'm really grateful for that perspective, and especially this year with the craziness with COVID. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Any other questions for Dave? All right, thanks for your report. And next up, we have the pre-expulsion report. Erin?
Yep, that's me. So a little break from COVID for a minute. So this is just the annual pre-expulsion report. So I'll just kind of give you the highlights of the data and talk through how this works. Just to remind you, Hudson School District has used this process for about 30 years. And so the purpose is to address expellable behavior and avoid, when possible, referring students to the board for expulsion. So during the pre-expulsion conference, the district works with the student and the family to discuss the behavioral incident, its causes, and the student's educational and discipline record. And the outcome of pre-expulsion is either to move forward with an expulsion hearing or to develop a voluntary agreement in which the student and family agree to a number of conditions. So on the first page of the report, you can see some examples of the conditions that may be proposed by the district. The conditions really serve to prevent future behavioral incident and set the student up for success. So during the 2019-20 school year, 7 pre-expulsion conferences were held. 2 of those resulted in an agreement in lieu of expulsion. And unfortunately, this year, the district held 5 expulsion hearings, which is a little higher than in the last few years past. Something to definitely highlight is the work of both the middle school and the high school continue to increase their utilization of behavior contracts with students within their building, which essentially limited the amount of pre-expulsion conferences that were necessary and saw a change in behavior by handling things at the building when they could. It also limited the amounts that students are missing due to suspensions. Both secondary schools also increased their utilization of restorative practices as a way to provide increased learning opportunities as a result of disciplinary issues. And research definitely continues to support the use of restorative practice as a way to increase understanding of the impact of behavior on others and increase positive behavior and choices. Just a little bit more about the data. Male students accounted for 57% of the pre-expulsion meetings this year. And this year, the high school accounted for 100% of the pre-expulsion meetings. So we had no middle school students participate in a pre-expulsion conference this year. Looking at students with disabilities, they accounted for 57%. And again, this is disproportionate in terms of the percent that students with IEPs represent as a whole. That's about 13% district-wide. So something that we're going to want to pay attention to just with our disciplinary data and how we're responding to students with disabilities. Questions about the data or any other?
Any board members with questions regarding the pre-expulsion expulsion report, kind of an annual report?
Yep.
That, all right. Not hearing anything. Thank you for your report, Aaron.
Thank you.
All right. Next up on the agenda then is the 2021 budget update. It's, I guess, preliminary budget, even though we're into that budget year. Tim, I think we'll start it off talking about the year-end numbers now that 2019-2020 year is done.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Jamie. So yeah, we are. We wound up. We're in the process of the audit, finishing that audit and wrapping that up. And so, assuming that if we don't have any adjustments, we're going to finish the year approximately 5.7 million under where we thought we would. So that's good news going forward as we go through some of the other points here. But to give you a little flavor, again, we've talked about these areas before a few months ago. Health insurance, self-funded health insurance, we saw a drastic drop in our claims, obviously because of those people only going in for really needed things. Any preventative appointments were delayed or postponed, and other elective surgeries postponed. So we saw a very big dip in those claims in the last few months. However, we kind of expected this, that at some point in time, there's kind of this pent up demand. And so we saw July claims for this year pop up quite a bit. They're much higher than our average. And we could expect that to move really back to the averages or maybe even above average for the 2021 fiscal year. We had a reduction. The other area that was under budget was 1.1 million in salaries, wages, including substitute costs. That we had a lot of savings there. Postponed capital projects, reduced utilities and payments to service providers was 1.1 million under budget. And then supplies and equipment purchases about $350,000. So that makes up the majority of 5.7 million. And then I'll just move on to the next piece here, which is the 2021 budget. And so one of the things with that spending that didn't happen is it could have a positive impact on our state aid for next year. That's because we're negatively aided most of the time, and this would have a positive effect on that tertiary aid level. But again, you know, there's still talk of a budget repair bill that could still happen for the 2021 year. So, you know, very likely that we won't see much of an increase, that we'd probably even see a reduction in aid if that happens, that materializes, which would be later this fall. So when we look at the current version of the budget that you're going to look at shortly here, we've updated that to include a lot of different costs for COVID-19 related expenses, so to mitigate our risks. So as Nick mentioned earlier, we spent about $365,000 on dividers and barriers, and those dividers and barriers cover classrooms. So if you have tables, they have dividers there. The cafeteria tables, as was mentioned earlier as well, those dividers are there. We're cutting back on that capacity by about 50% in our lunchrooms. And then looking at those high traffic areas such as offices, places where students and staff are face-to-face a lot. So I want to thank Jim Staskell and his crew as well, because they worked under some pretty tight timelines. Looks like we'll have all those barriers, almost all of those barriers in place by the start of school. So they did a really great job getting things ordered and making sure we had enough suppliers on hand to get things where we needed those. Another large area, you can see that second bullet point, about $500,000, and those are masks, gloves, paper products, sanitizers, disinfectants, and applicator equipment. There is a shortage on, you know, the hand sanitizers, the wipes that you see, you've probably heard. They don't expect that to go away until 2021. We've been able to order up some supplies. I will say, however, we'll have to gauge the usage. This may not be the last order. It probably will not be. But we'll continue to monitor that as we go forward. We've spent approximately $200,000 for technology for families in classrooms at this point. Then another one that's a little larger is $800,000 for increased substitute pay, as we talked about last meeting, and the additional cleaning staff. That would cover up to 7 full-time equivalents for cleaning staff. Right now, we've hired about 2.5, so we're just gauging where that need's going to fall at this point. So that is, again, one of the larger drivers when you look at the new version of the budget. The good news, the preliminary estimate of property valuation in the district is a little bit over 7%, just under about 7.2%. When you look at the statewide preliminary estimates, it's about 5.5%. So when we looked at that, getting down to bottom line on the budget, we had about $1.5 million deficit budget when we added all of those pieces in. And so at this point, we did keep the mill rate the same at a reduction of 3.96% over last year, and the levy increase, the levy was increased by about $550,000 from the last time you saw that in July. So then moving on to just a take on the 21-23 biennial. So when we look at the state, we're hoping, we've been told the state will come out with their estimates the end of the month here about what their tax revenues look like. And, you know, we're, you know, pretty much expecting that will be a shortfall. So the state could reduce our state aid in one or both years of the biennium. And as we experienced, if we use a yardstick measurement like the past couple of times this has happened, which was the Great Recession, And then with the passage of Act 10, our district experienced about a 10% or 10 and a fraction percent reduction in state aid. So, up to $2.5 million for a year. And if we use this past experience to kind of gain that perspective, that could be what we're looking at. We just don't know. There are a lot of different scenarios that could play out here, but we want to just keep that in mind as we're looking at the budget. If we look at those reductions in expenditures, the 5.7, which was actually be about 6.3, 6.4, because we had a surplus budget going into the year. What can happen is some of that, some of the savings could cover some or all of those potential state aid shortfalls over the 2 years by using fund balance. One of the other pieces that really doesn't help us a lot is that when we look at the CARES Act funding, the distribution formula for that really only qualified us for about $121,000. A lot of districts received a lot more than that, but it was based on free and reduced lunch counts. And if another stimulus package gets passed, and if there are monies for schools, if that stays and that the formula distribution doesn't change, it's unlikely that we're going to see any large pieces of funding attributable to that. So just some points to remember as we review the budget. So I'll just jump into that. As I mentioned, if we look at the top sides, the revenues, we'd be going from about 2% to a 3.3% change. That's that additional 550,000 to close some of the deficit budget that we've got existing in this case. Other local revenues have been reduced because those are things like gate fees and for competitions and that type of thing. Again, as you heard Aaron give his report, we're looking at possibly a very different scenario for sports. So we don't want to overestimate where we think we'll be with that revenue. So that's been cut back. We've go to look under the equalization aid, which is a large part of it. That one hasn't changed. Again, that's down 4.1%. So we'll have to wait and see. It's kind of a wait and see to see what the legislature does with any potential budget repair bill, see how that's affected. If we look at per pupil aid, another larger piece hasn't changed. That one has remained in place. That's an area they could do a simple cut and just reduce per pupil aid. But again, all the cards are on the table at this point. And then we had an increase in some of the federal funding sources, so that one's been increased. So when we get to the bottom line of revenues, we're looking at about a 0.5% increase. And then if we move to expenditures, we have bumped up, again, I talked about the sub costs, additional sub costs for that increase in pay so that we can attract subs and we can continue to operate. And then also the facilities and ground staff so that we have people in the facilities that can keep up with all the additional cleaning that has to be done. So that increased slightly. We had, if you look at numbers 300 and 400, which are other purchase services and non-capital objects, that's where the majority of that almost $2 million for COVID expenditures is residing. So when you see those increases, that's why. If we look at most of the other numbers haven't changed significantly, some have gone down, but we're looking at about a 2.9% increase in expenditures. So again, if you look at the revenues compared to the expenses, we're about 982,000, just about $1 million as a deficit budget. And then if we run down into the committed and unassigned fund balance summary, and just looking on that right-hand side, the capital projects fund, we should wind up about $1.7 million remaining in that fund. Self-funded health insurance remaining at $1.9 million, and that leaves a projected unassigned fund balance of $23.4 million. So when you look at what is the lower end of the fund balance and policy at 25% of expenditures, we're at about $5.4 million above that. And again, that would be and looking at that, that would be money that could potentially be needed if we get large cuts in state aid or the budget repair bill for this year. We may be looking at 3 years where we have to cover reductions in state aid. So, but again, going down to those last few lines under that estimated mill rate, that's remained the same as what you saw it in July. So about a almost a 4.4% reduction in the mill rate. So, all right, so I've gone through all that. Do you have any questions?
Mr. President,
Yes, Rob.
just a few quick questions. The CARES monies that were available, I know several counties had significant monies left over that are transferable to other public entities like school districts. I don't know, I know you guys are talking to the county all the time. Were there any leftover dollars there that might be usable by us? I guess that's my first question.
Something we can follow up on that. I'm not aware of that they have any additional monies left over, but we can follow up on that, Rob.
Okay.
And check.
And then looking at revenues, 345 open enrollment in 9.7% increase is significant. Do we have an idea what led to that high level of additional enrollees in?
Yeah, I think some of the virtual that we've got, and then we've had, I think, even facilities could be attributing to that. But when we looked at that number, that did pop up this year. So we're pretty good. If you compare it, we're still a little negative in this update. The open enrollment out under that second line under expenditures is $1,061,000. So we're a little over $130,000, deficit when you compare the ins and the outs. But it's been improving.
Okay. And the last question, federal sources. There's a dramatic increase there in revenue. Is that nutrition, or what led to that increase?
Yeah, so that one is the part of that would be that $121,000 from the CARES Act. The other part, there are some additional grants that were available. I want to say mental health is in that. We had some. I think we also had some career technical ed funding that was there. So that although all of those popped that number up for us.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions by board members? So this is for Tim or Nick. If you haven't heard anything from the federal level that rather than punishing school districts that don't open 5 days a week, has there been any talk of rewarding school districts that open 5 days a week, K through 12?
I've not heard anything. And one of the biggest challenges that we have with federal funding, as Tim alluded to, is a lot of times it tends to be based off of some other mechanism they have to distribute federal funding. And federal funding is usually tied to poverty rates in school districts. And so since we have such low poverty rate in Hudson, we tend to not get a very large chunk of it. So as Tim said, even if there's another stimulus that they kick around, unless they decide they're going to distribute it in a different manner, I would not hold your breath to think that we're going to get any type of significant federal bailout related to our costs related to COVID, which is kind of too bad when you think about it, because it's whether you're in an affluent or non-affluent community, you have cost associated with it just based on the number of kids you have.
So Tim, just to sum up then, with the preliminary budget, where we're tracking now in late August compared to a final budget gets approved with a levy in October, you're projecting a levy decrease of 4%. But because of the increased property valuations, it's actually going to yield another 550,000 in property
right. Yeah,
tax
the mill
revenue.
rate. Yeah, the mill rate would go down 4%. Yeah.
But
So, yeah.
but because of increased property valuations, we'll actually see 550,000 more in revenue, but we're spending 1.5 million more because of COVID purchases and
Yes.
conditions.
Yeah, almost. Yeah, we're approaching that $2 million mark.
Okay.
In the COVID expenses. So and this, and I should add to this will be, if you guys are in agreement here, this is what we'll be going into. You'll probably see some additional changes, but hopefully nothing too drastic, but going into the annual meeting, because September 14th, next board meeting, review the budget one last time, and then we'll roll into the annual meeting that night.
Right. But one of the reasons, because of the leftover funds, if you will, from 1920, there's anticipation of increased expenses, a big wild card on what state will do over the next 2 years. And so we want to keep that reserve fund higher than 30% because, going into the next couple of years.
Yeah, this is definitely, Act 10 and the Great Recession were challenging, but this is light years ahead of that. And it's just so many variables right now going into it.
Yeah. Hopefully the economy does come back like a rubber band, like some are saying it's going to, but I think you've got us on the right path here. These are good projections. I think we're being fair to taxpayers, but also, fair to our mission and our goals of what we're trying to accomplish. And just way too many unknowns to try and carve this thing up any closer or cut the mill rate more now, or cut our reserve fund and leave us, closer to that 25% mark, I think would be unwise. But any other questions or comments? All right. Thanks, Tim, for the update.
You bet.
And last two items, we got an update now on our policies due to new Title IX regulations.
Yep, that's going to be Aaron handling that.
All right, thank you. So this is a little outside of our series of student policies that we're working to update right now. So earlier this summer, new Title IX regulations came out. And so those trainings have just started, I think, last week. So we're working our way through those. So I'll just kind of highlight a few of the things that these new regulations require districts to address. And then we can kind of walk through the changes and additions to our policies. So this affects both students and employees. So Andrea and I have been working together on this in collaboration with Shana as well. So one of the things we needed to look at was the non-discrimination policy statements regarding sex discrimination under Title IX, specifically including identification of the Title IX coordinator. Another thing we needed to look at is the grievance procedure for receiving and responding to complaints of sex discrimination under Title IX. District response when the district has actual knowledge of an incident or allegation of sexual harassment under Title IX, regardless of whether a formal complaint is filed. In addition, a grievance process for addressing formal complaints of sexual harassment, specifically under Title IX, and then record keeping, confidentiality, and non-retaliation in collection with all of the above things I just mentioned. So based on those changes, it really required us to amend some related student and employee policies. So tonight we're proposing changes to policies 512, 511, 411, and 411.1. And the addition of 2 student policies regarding Title IX, as well as 2 additional employee policies. Important to note too, these regulations are presently under several legal challenges. And so it's not clear at this time whether the challenges will result in the new regulations being struck down. So Shana's advice was really this approach with the standalone Title IX policy and rules allows the district to modify or remove any relevant provisions if there's changes that result in the legal challenges. Questions about any of that? It's a lot of information. So tonight we're just bringing these to you as drafts with the hope that we can kind of expedite this process because these do go into effect this month. And so approval at the next board meeting is what we would be looking at.
So we'd be waiving second reading or?
Yes.
Yep.
And that's in order to hasten the compliance with.
Correct. Yep.
All right. All right. Yes,
President,
Sue.
yeah. I'd asked Aaron a question on earlier too, because this sounded so strident. I guess I was taken back a little bit by some of it, but I was concerned if a student was on a trip abroad, which is not going to happen anyway, and they were assaulted or there was a sexual misconduct of some sort, then what happens? But you indicated to me, Aaron, that we could still pursue. I can't read
Yeah.
the fog
We-
here. Dealing with the allegations, right?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we consulted with Shayna on that as well. And it is a strange carve out in these new regulations, but it doesn't prohibit us from investigating any claims of sexual misconduct or sexual harassment during a school sponsored trip outside of the country. And we would certainly do the right thing in those situations and lean on our other policies to move forward with investigating those.
So our other policies help shore us up here at this point.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay.
And so in the packet that board members were provided, the four policies you mentioned, 411, 411.1, 511, and 512, they all have basically about a sentence that's underlined and in red as far as what's being added. And then it's a
Exactly.
cross-reference back to this new standalone Title IX policy.
Correct.
Will that be given a number by the time we meet on September 14th?
It will. Yep. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Is there questions then from anyone? Again, there's 45 pages there with these changes and new policies comprising most of that. But again, it's kind of repetitive when it's talking about sexual non-discrimination complaint procedures for students and for employees. Am I correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And the policies that we're updating are all fairly new. And so you're familiar with those.
Right. Okay. Heather, you had a question?
Yeah, Erin, quick question. So was the guidance that came out regarding Title IX really just related to policies and how things are stated, or does it have implications for practice?
It has some implications for practice. So there's a lot of regulations around the training of the Title IX coordinator, and then resources for training more people within a district. So we've been working through all of those modules. And so we'll start to plan out what our district kind of comprehensive training looks like for staff as well.
All right. Yes, Carrie.
Do you need a motion to approve the draft?
No.
No, this is just if there's any, this is kind of, yeah, it is kind of our first introduction, but this would be like when our other policies change, input questions, whether we're going in the right direction is kind of the feedback they want. But given that this has been kind of dictated, if you will, by legal counsel and, federal guidelines, we'll be looking for a motion to approve on the first reading, waiving the second reading at the next meeting. But good question. Any other questions about the content of the policies, the reasoning for it, or how we're going to deal with approving it on a short order because it needs to be in place for in the very near term? Okay, hearing none. I think, Aaron, you've got your answer that you're on the right track, and we'll watch for these in the next board packet. We don't meet again for 3 weeks. It will be a shortened meeting because it'll be our 1 hour plus edition that's prior to the annual meeting on September 14th. Okay. Any other, I guess we'll move on. What last thing is our book study. And I just want to see if board members want to have a brief recess before we talk about the book that we've been all reading, or do you want to just go right into the study? All right, I get one indication going straight in. Nobody needs to take a break. Rob's the only one that's on Zoom, so he could get up and take his break anytime. But he's giving me the thumbs up to move forward. All right. So with this, everyone has had the book. We read the introduction prior to the last meeting, and seem to get feedback that folks are ready to get into this. It's a deep topic, certainly, but one that is certainly necessary for us to get a good understanding of how we're going to improve topics like equity and anti-discrimination, if you will, and recognizing those things that are discriminatory. So there's a study guide that was I printed it off. And one of the recommendations that they made was that we rotate who leads this. And I guess by default, as the chair of these meetings, I'll start off leading this one, but I'll be looking for someone to lead the next study or the next discussion, which will be at the September work session. And when I looked at the book, I'm up to chapter 8. I know that at the last meeting, Heather announced that she's already finished the book, but my excuse is that I had to read How to Be an Anti-Racist, and that it's confusing to read two books like this at the same time. So I finished that one, and now I'm on chapter 8 on this one, but it looks like there are 50 pages, takes us through chapter 3. Another 50 pages take us through chapter 6, and the last 50 are really the last 6 chapters of the book. That's how I'd propose that we tackle this. Does anybody else see differently? All right. And then the other thing that, before we get into talking about the chapters, and we're not going to go over every single question. I mean, I think if we end up spending a lot of time on one, that's okay. Whatever is the group feels is appropriate. But there are certain principles that, the author was one. There's 2 authors to the reading guide, but Robert DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility, assisted in presenting this or preparing this study guide. And I'm just going to point out the 7 principles that we're supposed to keep in mind. Number 1 is that a strong opinion is not the same as informed knowledge, and that there is a difference between agreement and understanding. And if we have a deep interest in denying the forms of oppression that benefit us, that's kind of inherent. And so they want us to be cognizant of that. And number 4, racism goes beyond individual intentions to collective group patterns. Number 5, we don't have to be aware of racism in order for it to exist. And then number 6, our racial position will greatly affect our ability to see racism. And so we have to keep that in mind. And then finally, putting our effort into protecting rather than expanding our current worldview prevents our intellectual and emotional growth. And that's why I think that our willingness as a board just to get into the subject is, I think, an effort to expand our current worldview, which is important. So
Mr. President?
with that, in chapter 1 says the challenges of talking to white people about racism. I'll just ask a general question, and that is, was there anything that this author puts forward that caused a sense of discomfort? Or challenged maybe your thinking or your thoughts on this? And Heather?
Sure, I'll speak. I'll speak up. I think, and I don't have the exact words in front of me, but when she says basically that kind of progressive white people are doing more damage than anyone to addressing racial injustices in our culture, I mean that she opened with that pretty early in the book. I think that was a little bit of a kind of, you had to stop and think about it for me.
And did you find as you got further into the other chapters, maybe that some of that discomfort, did you notice it get worse or get better as you maybe read more on this author? I think you definitely need to read, I think, more pages
Mhm.
to get in the same mindset as the author. This is somebody who has worked on diversity training and racial issues for probably decades. So, Bob?
Well, my Post-its didn't stick as well as they should have. Damn you, 3M, I guess. You know, it's not a discomfort necessarily, or even to point at one passage or one thought from it. From reading all 3 chapters, I just kind of, my circular logic alarms were going off a little bit. You know, I'm getting a sense that I wrote my thought down here. You're either a racist or you're in denial. In other words, we're all racist. It's just what degree are we ignorant of our own racism? And when I say circular logic, I mean that kind of it puts you in a spin. It's critical of any defense you might have, and I get that if you have that thought in your head, like, well, you know, I work with a lot of colored people or black people. I do, you know, I'm related to some. That's not me. You know, it almost puts you on the defense from the beginning. And I just, you know, just from being a critical reader of papers, that kind of it's just a general feel of the whole book so far in the first 3 chapters.
Right.
Mr. President?
Yes, Rob.
So first, I just want to thank Aaron for sharing this study guide with me and ultimately all of us. So thanks for that, Aaron. With regards to discomfort, I didn't really see this as creating any kind of discomfort as much as it was an opportunity to look at all of this from a different perspective. You know, just looking through my own eyes in my own experiences, I think that everybody, generally speaking, is treated fairly, generally. You know, sort of as an individual, you bring onto yourself either the good things that happen in life or the not such good things that happen in life. What this book helped me with was just to create a better perspective. You know, that sometimes racism, we're not even thinking about it, but other folks live it. And it's certainly a challenge that I've not seen.
Right. I think one of the factors that impacts the comfort level is the fact that racism is such a evil, almost like a source of evil. You know, it's something that you don't want to be. You don't want to be considered a racist, but because of how racism came about and how it's just inculcated itself throughout and permeated our whole culture, that it's just something that it's still there, even though if you want to deny that you're not a racist, it's still there. And it's hard to not have inclinations. All of us grew up with different backgrounds, but I don't know, is there any board members that, went to a high school where it was more than 50% people of color? Do we have anybody? Let's see, what's the most urban school district? Just go around. Where did you go to high school, Heather?
LeSueur.
What's that?
LeSueur.
LeSueur. Okay.
So we had 2 adopted Korean kids and 1 biracial kid. Yeah.
That was it.
That was it. Yeah.
And everyone knows I'm from New Glarus, and yeah, there was 2 black brothers. I think they were actually twins, a couple years below my grade, but that was the extent of the minority makeup in our whole school district. Bruce?
Yeah, Locke. No, it was
No.
very Norwegian, Scandinavian.
Right. And Carrie?
Des Moines, Iowa, which still was pretty much like Hudson, maybe a little more urban, but not a whole lot.
Yeah. Okay. And Sue?
I graduated way up north, Minnesota, from Grand Rapids High School. And even then, I was self-conscious that our team was called the Indians.
Okay.
And so probably in terms of race, we had some Native American people. But most of the people in the kind of mining world that we moved to were like Swedish or Finnish and we had a large Serbian population. So it kind of came down to jokes would be made about whichever group you weren't a part of. But so I think that was an awareness for me, but I've kind of decided in my own grown-up world that in terms of the Black community, I guess maybe I have to be honest and say that it's kind of context. If I'm around quote unquote, politicians and education or something, then I'm comfortable. But when I was in Memphis on a bus going to the art museum and I was the only white person on the bus, I was uncomfortable and I had to face that reality.
Sure. Well, thank you for sharing that. And Rob, I don't want to leave you out. How about your high school was what and where?
So I went to high school in Hoffman Estates, Illinois, which is a northwest suburb of Chicago. But prior to that, my elementary years through seventh grade was in a town called Bensonville. And it was, if you want to call it a backyard, it was small, but there was a 4-lane highway and then O'Hare Airport was just beyond that. And most of my neighbors and the kids that I grew up were either Pakistani, Mexican, or Black. So that was probably more, I should say that was pretty diverse. But my high school experience was not diverse.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. And Carrie.
Oh,
Bob.
My high school was in Wausau, and we were called the Lumberjacks, so that wasn't supposed to be a big deal, but with all the people tree loving, it turned out to be a little bit, but they still are called the Lumberjacks proudly. I had 2 classmates that were Black growing up in middle school and in high school. And both of them were adopted by white families, I believe. So it actually created an interesting perspective of being raised in a white city by white people, parents, and going off to college. And one of them had commented how was expected to didn't really fit in with the Black kids, and also was the white kids, didn't know how to treat him either. Just an interesting kind of strange to that. But I always thought, my parents or my neighbors and parents, they weren't racist. They just didn't know didn't have any experience with other races. And I've always, thought every generation, and we have change. So I found this book to be interesting, but like I said, it's like I actually kind of noticed that we're certainly not the only board that's reading this book. A lot of company boards and groups, it's a very popular book right now.
Right.
So I wonder, is it going to be looked at as, it's so popular, is looked at as like the go-to guide? And I'm a little uncomfortable with that, being written by a white author, and I just wonder how Black authors feel about that.
Right.
So,
Well, I having read the How to Be an Anti-Racist by Kendi, that actually he seeks out a book review from Robin DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility. And so they're very much kind of supportive of each other. Not identical in their approach, but I mean, some similar themes anyway, and certainly gets you thinking. But yeah, Heather, did you have a addition to Bob's question?
I was just going to say, I think I actually liked it for that reason, because I think she, as a white person, is writing to white people. It's a we book. And I'm thinking, I know there was recently that forum downtown Hudson. I watched it on Facebook Live at the
It was
Hop
at
and Barrel.
Hop and Barrel,
Yeah. And the one young woman who's a Hudson High School graduate, Black woman, and she basically said, white people, we are tired of answering your questions, like do some of this work yourself. And so I think this book is not that we shouldn't be, I think, seeking out and listening to Black voices, to other perspectives. But I kind of liked that I didn't have to work really hard to connect, because she was speaking from an experience that was not totally dissimilar from mine. I also really liked that early on, she, I don't want to say takes issue with, but she kind of holds up the word racism or racist and really differentiates prejudice and discrimination, like the individual actions that we control. And she carves that out and then says, but this racism is this structural thing. And so it almost gives you permission not to worry about if someone is or isn't a racist, which I think, to your point, Jamie, has such, like, you're a bad person if you're a racist,
right?
But kind of to look at how do your behaviors either support or challenge a kind of a social structure that is racist. And so that, I thought, almost made it easier to swallow, because we do struggle. I remember after the shooting in Minneapolis, talking with my husband about all of the anger about cops, about police officers, and him saying something, well, think about the police officers we know. I mean, they're good guys. And saying, I don't think this is about being a good person or not. It's about whether or not, like, you end up doing things that later maybe you step back and go, gosh, I can't believe I did that. So I think that for me, I liked the separating the prejudice and discrimination from the acts that we control individually from this broader concept of racism. So that worked for me. But I appreciate your point, Bob, about also needing to hear other voices that aren't white. That's part of the work that I think is really important that we do, and the listening that we do.
Right. I think, yeah. What's that? Oh,
Well, I was just going to
Bob.
comment that I know Rob was there as well we had that march in Hudson, and when people started speaking, there were numerous Black people in the audience, young Black people, and to me it was just an uncomfortable moment, because I wanted them to speak, and finally they did, but it almost felt ridiculous that here we're having this march, and I wondered what was going through their minds, listening to these white people in Hudson talk about how we need change and understanding and that. So I know Rob could comment on that too, but I was very glad that they did speak. So.
Well, you mentioned about the generalizations, and I think it's number 4 under the chapter 1 questions was, how can we make generalizations about what it means to be white when we don't know each person's individual story? So that's one of the things that, that's why I got into, each person has their own background and how they're raised. We don't have to get into super detailed on that, but that's the thing, absent knowing what the individual story is, judging people based on generalizations. Go ahead, Karen.
Well, I think from her perspective, she gave a lot of credence to that, because she can speak to the generalizations, because we do all benefit from the societal structure in which we've all grown up and this country's grown up. And it kind of puts it beyond, it doesn't matter what our prejudice or discriminations are individually, because our society has that in place and we all benefit. half of us in this room more than the other half, but certainly because we're all white, we're several steps ahead from the beginning.
Right. I think the obvious things of racism are like slavery, lynchings, and as long as I haven't participated in a lynching, then I'm not a racist. I mean, that was the bar 150 years ago, but it's much more subtle and insidious now. And what I'm hopeful in reading this book is that we become more aware of how our policies could have unintended, racial impacts. And that's recognizing just this implicit bias. I think that's what you're talking about, Carrie, is it's there, whether we consciously recognize it or not.
Well, and so much of it's built up in our unconscious thoughts and how we were raised. And because we were, that she talks about in you can say I was sheltered in a certain part, or, how you were brought up, but doesn't necessarily mean that you're given a pass just because of that. It just provides a perspective on your upbringing, your unconscious thoughts that are always kind of going on in your brain that I think are creating kind of your current perspective. And it's difficult to get past that at times, and not necessarily understand exactly what you're doing or why you're doing it. It's just a part of your being or who you are. So I think to your point earlier, it is good to try and create that awareness and more of that introspective thought pattern, because it does create opportunities for you to think about, what are those instances or situations that you are put into where you may just jump to a very quick conclusion.
Yeah. Carrie.
Jumping on to Bruce's point about that, we probably, it sounds like most of us, other than Rob, grew up in a somewhat sheltered environment. A lot of the impressions we do have, as she pointed out, were from media, which is predominantly white. So.
Right.
Jamie?
Yes, Rob.
Yeah, just to build on what, Carrie's saying. I mean, I think as for most of us, our exposure many times to people of different races, comes through the news, comes through media, comes through, what we see politically, happening. And so if our exposure is mostly through media, I mean, how can that not create bias which lead to discrimination? And as far as racism, just listening or reading through the book, I mean, it sounds as if, all of us are complicit in racism, because it's the rules and regulations and everything that comes out of, the whether it's the government or, other associations. So it's not necessarily individuals who are racist, it's the overall society, if I understood the book correctly.
Right. Just to end this discussion on chapter 1, or transition into 2, is that question number 3 is, how do so many white people feel so confident in their opinions on racism, even as they live their lives in segregation? I think that that's kind of the point that Bruce and Carrie and, we're getting at, is without having had that background, how is it that we could be so confident that, we're not racist, if we haven't had we've been segregated from those other experiences? I don't know if anybody else, Heather, do you have any other point on that?
No, not on that one. No.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So
I do think though, Jamie,
Yes.
the one other thing in chapter 1 that I thought was so important, kind of setting the stage for the rest of the book, and I hadn't really thought about it before, but is when I like that she puts this into a historical context, not just the history of racism in the United States, but the history of the United States, because that last piece about how deeply rooted this country is in, individual freedoms and the value of the meritocracy. You know, that from the very beginning, we are a country that believes in a meritocracy. So believes basically that you as an individual get what you deserve. And if you work hard enough, kind of you'll get your rewards, and how that plays out in conversations about race and racial inequities. And when that rolls over into policy and other things, I hadn't really thought before about that meritocracy, that how strongly held a value that is in our country and how deep those historical roots are. Because I think it plays out in day-to-day conversations with people as we kind of struggle with how to address some of these issues. So I thought that was really important.
Yes. And you mentioned before about social construct. And so that's the first question under chapter 2 of the racism and white supremacies. What does it mean to say that race is socially constructed? Yes.
You know, I remember, over the years of teaching art history, not talking about women, and then finally including women artists. And then I remember a point in time when I started to include Black artists. And then the Walker Art Center had huge walls filled with Kara Walker, which just shocks you when you first look at her work. And so I guess for me it was like shock therapy, and I would just make myself jump into these things, and I remember that was it was good for me, but I realized how much I hadn't done, I hadn't included and dismissed. But again, I don't have any excuses for it, but it is that social conditioning, so that you don't jump out of your own lane. And so it's just a very steep learning curve for us that I think we should be on. And I'm glad that we're engaging in this book so that I'm doing the should be on leap here.
Thank you for that observation. Any other thoughts on the social construction
President?
aspect? Yes, Rob.
Just quickly getting back to media, something that struck me was that, and I forget how long ago it was that Ellen DeGeneres came out, and the media started portraying same-sex relationships in a different light, and now today it's much more well received. Similarly, through many of the things that have been happening in society, we now start seeing more interracial relationships, whether it's in commercials or on billboards or whatever the case is. And over time, that will also become more and more widely accepted. And so as far as the socially constructed, I think, again, as it was mentioned earlier by Carrie, what we see in society through our media dictates or helps us to start have those conversations around what should be comfortable for us and what should be taboo. And it's good. I'm glad to see that, many of the commercials and media portraying a much more evolved society.
Okay. Yes, Heather.
Well, and Jamie, and I think if I'm remembering right, part of her point, I mean, it's socially constructed because it's not biologically constructed, right? I mean, she was saying that there's no biological thing that makes us white or Black or Asian, that we have, and we white people primarily have kind of decided what goes in each of those categories. And so that it's not something that a DNA test reveals about you, because it's not necessarily tied to geography or whatever. It's that it's a construct that was created to serve societies well, to help societies do what they wanted to do.
Right. So what is the difference between racial prejudice, racial discrimination, and racism? Anybody wants to tackle that one?
Well, I think I touched on that earlier, right? I mean,
Yeah.
And what I did appreciate was that she said, like, and don't feel bad about the fact that you have prejudice or discriminate, because like the way our brains work, you couldn't not kind of have prejudice and discriminate, because that's how we go about our daily life.
Right.
But ultimately, racism is a societal thing,
Mhm.
is what I got from the book. It's not necessarily an individual, but it's the rules and regulations and everything that comes out of society, or governments and other powerful organizations that dictate how we treat people who are, in some eyes, considered less, to keep the authority and the power in the hands of those that currently have it.
Right. I thought it was interesting because they talked about, you said the difference between prejudice and discrimination and racism, and Rob obviously hit the nail on the head that she describes racism as being more systematic, being more of a societal, construct. But really, there was an interesting line in here that highlighted that discrimination is action based on prejudice. So, prejudice might be more of your thoughts, your feelings, your kind of your own personal construct of how you make sense in the world, but then that discrimination piece is your actions as it relates to it. And the biggest difference, and depending on where your prejudice lie, your discrimination can potentially change.
Right. Exactly. And that's, yep. The prejudice is an individual's, thoughts. Discrimination is more based on individual acts, but racism can't be, it's out there regardless of the individual. What did the author mean when there's no such thing as reverse racism?
What I took from that was just that it is strictly against people of color, like to turn it around what Nick was just pointing out, that to take action to specifically try to hire African Americans or people of other descent could be perceived by some to be reverse racism, that we wouldn't be promoting or hiring a white teacher who was equally qualified. And it's not reverse racism because we're seeking out a different perspective, but we're not. It cannot be against a white person, was her point.
Right.
I think it had to do right with the power, like what they talked about, like that to your point, you have to be like, people who are in power are the ones who have the power to make a decision that changes things. And so I think about, there's similar conversations about sexism, and and you certainly can be prejudiced as a woman against men, you can discriminate as a woman against men, but that sexism similarly is about a power dynamic, I think. So I think it would be a similar sort of, it's about a power dynamic. So that makes
and
sense.
Yeah, she gave the example that white women got the right to vote, but it was white men who granted them that right.
Yeah.
Right.
They couldn't grant it to themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that in the end, I mean, that's what I got both out of Kendi's book and this book with D'Angelo, is that it has to be white people that eliminate racism. It's not something that can just happen among the minority population. It's got to be something that white people take affirmative action to stamp out and recognizing it as the number one. What did you think of that birdcage metaphor illustrating the oppression? That's, where you step back and you see the bird and you can see that it's inside the bars. But if you go really close, you see the bird and you don't see the bars. And you can say, well, it must be just want to be where it's at. It's not being, we get so close to a situation as white people that we don't recognize that there's obstructions to the minorities and keeping them in the places that they're at, or keeping them from aspiring or ascending, I guess.
It actually made me think, Jamie, we've talked a little bit about maybe having an equity audit done. And I think it's a similar case for that sometimes people who are in the district are just too close to it. Like, so the analogy here, we're too close to the birdcage. You kind of need someone to come in who isn't that close and who can look at the situation from a little bit of an outsider's perspective to get a better sense for the actual situation. But yeah.
Okay. I appreciate that viewpoint there. And then jumping down to number 8, there was a statement she quotes that race is the child of racism, not the father. It's that chicken and egg, which one came first? But do tend to agree with Coates' statement that race is the child of racism and not the father?
I think it goes back to that original construct that racism is created by by society. It's in place purely to maybe benefit one group over another. And so therefore, without having that in place, there would be no need to think about race, but it's in place. And so therefore, it's kind of that racism was happening first, and then that automatically became then the need to identify people by race in order to implement racism.
Yeah, that's what Candy talked about, the racism actually starting, and he's, documents the birth or the start of racism back to the 14th, 15th century, just prior to, slavery and, transatlantic slavery, well, was in other continents as well, but racism had to be created to justify the different treatment. Now, finally, how is the author using the term white supremacy? Because you hear the term white supremacy, white privilege, and then the name of the book is White Fragility, which one of the later chapters goes into a lot more about why it's that. But what is the author, how is this author using the term white supremacy?
Well, the book talks about protecting the processes it describes and obscure the mechanisms of racial inequality. And so, ultimately, as Nick was talking about earlier, before racism was racism, when we were talking about Coates just a second ago, there were people that had more power and looked for ways to take resources from those that were not as strong and find ways to keep them away. And so when we talk about white supremacy, we just want to continue ultimately those processes or those means by which we keep those that don't have access to the resources away from them.
She also spoke about how it kind of set the structure, not just, in the West, but globally, and it was kind of how it was built, that structure around, where, how whites were perceived back then.
Okay. Any other observations on that? Okay, then we'll move on to chapter 3, which talks about racism after the civil rights movement. So there's kind of different periods. Obviously, you had slavery, where racism, at its height in the 1860s. You have the Civil War, supposedly ends that and gives them civil rights. But as you know, Jim Crow laws and the white supremacists allowed blacks to be prevented from having the right to vote, and took another 100 years. And actually, everyone thinks that civil rights only happened in the 1960s, but that was something that definitely was a post-World War II. It built up over the 50s and into the 60s. But the civil rights movement actually started before Martin Luther King. But then, just because the Voting Rights Act passed in 65, it didn't mean the end of racism either. And so let's talk about what is the impact of white people not knowing our racial history? Bob?
I think it's, this is, after civil rights, but like you said, obviously began earlier than that. I think it's an opportunity to look at what we don't know about Black racial history. I never learned much about the Tulsa Race Massacre from 1921. A lot of Black people were unaware of it, and it took a HBO series called The Watchmen just recently to open people's eyes and say, well, what's that about? And start researching it. And now all of a sudden that is like our country has kind of embraced that and is like looking back and studying that as far as, you know, the segregate yourself, you know, the Black community did what they, you know, pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, like we're all told everybody should. You know, they created their own banks and businesses and commerce, and you know, the reaction of the white locals at that time was pretty disastrous. But it's just when you say, I just think it's very interesting that just happened this year, that this new interest in something from 1921 that I never learned about it in school. and
Right.
and I read something, you know, I think numerous things about that, how important that was for Black people that we're also not aware of that.
Right.
So it's the education, it's how we, you know, winners write the history, that kind of thing. It's very interesting.
Right.
Yeah. For Juneteenth.
Yes, that's what the Juneteenth, that's what that was tied to. Yeah. I think I saw the reference to Black History Month is February, but you know, should we be having just a Black History Month, or should we be having Black History semester semester long courses where we get into more detail about, you know, other than the I Have a Dream speech and Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. That's pretty much the extent of our you know, Black culture education back in the 70s when I was in high school. But what is colorblind racism and why is it problematic?
If I can speak to that, I would say she's making the point that it doesn't matter if I'm white, you're Black, you're brown, we're all the same. We all have value, but it does matter what my history is, what your perspective is, and we need to recognize that. That was kind of most eye-opening for me, that I haven't considered people's history and perspective and their culture and how that's different and how their aspirations are different, and that's okay. And that was kind of talking about the melting pot too, that succeeding is becoming part of the white success story. So that's for me.
Okay.
I think I like Carrie's point, you know, about the melting pot, because it's sort of like it shall be written that if you melt into the big pot, then you'll be just like us, the white social structure. And it's sort of like it's a safe place to go, just melt into the pot and be part of being American first and so on. And yet, you know, the balance here is finding your own self-distinction, and also being part of wherever you're living, you know, in this case, America, North America. That's another one, North America. We're North Americans. Yeah, it's like you got to be thinking about these inconsistencies all the time. I mean, we need to in our curriculum and how we conduct our business as a board. But it's really just hard to get your head to get out of wherever it's at right now in terms of our preferential position as white people. And the only time I think about that is when I have to fill out a form, except now I think it says Caucasian that you check.
So any other problems with colorblind racism? I really appreciate, Sue, the fact that you mentioned, you know, the melting pot. And as an artist, you know, when you melt and combine colors, you don't come up with white.
No, you get totally neutral.
Right. And that's why people identify in their head white as being neutral.
Yeah.
But what we need to learn and get our heads around is that white is the construct of, no, white's at the top and it's better than
Mhm.
anybody that has color. So if you say, I'm just blind, I treat everybody, no matter what their color of skin, the same, you're kind of denying that the social construct has already been in place for 6 centuries that makes white people, quote unquote, supreme.
Mhm.
Even whether you consciously say it, it's still there. You don't have to test for COVID to say that if there's nobody test for COVID, then all the COVID cases would go away. It's the same thing with racism. If we just deny that it's there and treat everyone, quote unquote, the same, I don't see race, it doesn't mean that it's still not there.
Well, and I know someone I know recently quoted Dr. Martin Luther King's, his famous speech about, the day when I'll be judged not by the color of my skin, but by the content of my character. He doesn't say nobody will know what color I am or talk about. He just says like there's something more than my color that people will look at. Right. But I think it's in addition to, it shows. I liked the story in the book that she called out about when she was co-facilitating with someone, and it was a Black man, I think, and someone in the group said, well, I didn't even notice you were Black, basically. And the guy kind of, called BS and said, well, I don't believe that, and it's not okay with me. Like, I want you to notice that I'm Black because that's part of who I am. But I think there is, there's a belief that's very permeable and in our community here about like it's better to not see race and just treat everyone the same and as if you are blind to color and don't notice it, when I think at least a lot of the points she makes is that that's actually not real, like that we have to acknowledge what we notice and talk about it and value it and listen to people's stories and think about how we respond.
Why does the author say that white progressives cause the most daily harm to people of color?
I don't recall if that was the part where, she was just kind of talking about how, again, you're kind of, placing, situational, like, don't live in that location. If you move into this, if you're going to be a teacher here, I would stay away from this location or that location.
Mhm.
So they're kind of, I don't recall if that's what she was referencing there, but it seemed to me like that it's kind of a theme in the chapter anyway, that talked a little bit about that. So I think, again, they're not necessarily internalizing it. They just are living their lives and thinking, just kind of that they're not necessarily putting people in different positions, but yet they are. They're just doing it kind of unconsciously.
Right. I think one of the things that white progressives cause daily harm is their denial of, racism. They know it's wrong and everything, but they don't want to admit that there's implicit bias. And that failure to recognize that and call it out for what it is, I think ends up just perpetuating. It's the reason why, we haven't made big strides in civil rights since, I was, a kindergartner. I remember the Weekly Reader and, reading about Martin Luther King.
Mm.
What did it take? It took 20 years, roughly 20 years after his death to get a holiday. But these little, that's a tiny progress being made. I think it's a positive thing, but yet when we've done something like that, it's like, okay, now we've made a national holiday for MLK. So now we can go on to other things. We don't have to talk about racism anymore. We got to the point where we did in the 60s only because of television. If there had been television back in the 1870s and 1880s in the post-Civil War, when people were being lynched by the dozens and in some cases, hundreds, it would have ended even sooner. But it was kind of something that happened down there. People heard rumors about it, but as long as it stayed down there and didn't come up north, but
Mhm.
wasn't it Duluth that had kind of a lynching
Lynching.
that was like less than 100 years ago,
Mhm.
or about 100 years ago?
Well, I think in near Mankato, right?
Okay.
There was one in Mankato also, but Duluth had one in kind of relatively modern history. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
whether it was Mankato or Duluth, yes, that's kind of the point, is that you don't need that kind of extreme action. But yet, once we showed the violence that was associated with it, then finally there was affirmative action taken. But then after we got complacent, if you will, and now we still have, it's funny reading these books, and they mention the Black people who have been killed, whether it's police brutality or in other means, and yet nothing has gotten done yet. And so it takes, I think, some white progressives are going to have to get there, but not just white progressives. It's going to have to be all people at getting to that point. Anything else?
I do think, James, as you mentioned media, she runs down that list of kind of control over the Hollywood and the this and the that, which I do then wonder about how different it is becoming now because of social media. And I mean, just the videos of recent things that are happening that are easily shared is one, but I also think about, my 14-year-old and those of you who have teenage kids and the content that she sees like on TikTok and other places, that the playing field's kind of been leveled. Like it's easier for people who maybe come from communities without a lot of power to get their voice out there and get things shared. So she's actually got a lot of interesting perspectives that she shares. And sometimes I raise my eyebrows, but I think that it'll be interesting to see how that plays out with that generation, with not the 20 somethings now, but the teens now, as they are growing up in this world where a lot of the media they consume is not Hollywood movies, but it's this peer produced stuff. I think it'll be interesting to see what perspectives they come through with.
Right. Yeah.
And whether or not they act differently. I guess that's the important part, right? Whether they act differently than most of us do.
I don't know if there's a subsequent chapter or later chapter on the impact of social media, but that would be a whole nother thing, because I think an argument could be made that racism has gotten worse in the last couple years with social media and the keyboard courage that people have. It's become almost acceptable in some areas to convey what are racist thoughts, even though they don't label them that way. That's still what they are.
You're right. Everybody's got more access to voice, not just these communities that previously have not. Yeah.
Why does the author consider young white people today, this goes to the point that you just made, Heather, to be no less racist than the white people of, the 1800s or the 1950s? And why are young people no less racist today?
Well, young people, generally speaking, just again, reading through the book, they look at the election of Barack Obama and some of the progress that has been made. And I would think they would suggest that racism is behind us, in their experience and seeing everything around them, that there's, according to the book, too much emphasis that's being put on race relations and other issues from a societal standpoint. And if that truly is their opinion, that'll just continue to push us down a really bad path. It's that denial of racism, that things are better today than they were. And why do we continue to focus on race when it's not an issue from their perspective?
Do you think part of that is the failure of today's young people to appreciate and understand, the history of our country, how we've treated blacks, how we've treated Native Americans?
I wonder, Jamie, if instead it goes back to kind of what we started with, that, it used to be, pre-civil rights era, it used to be that racism was about someone like openly saying, I don't think blacks are as good as, I don't want my kids mixing. I mean, that open, and I think about our kids now who would just kind of say, well, race doesn't matter. Like, LGBTQ, that doesn't matter. I mean, like but not recognizing then that this piece about power. So even if you as a kid can say, I'll be friends with whoever, like, look at, we elected a Black, I'll vote for whoever, but not recognizing that there's still, a system in place that no matter how nice they might be or how friendly they might be to other people of other races, it still is harder for those folks to get done what's easier for them. So I wonder if that's part of it, if it really does get back to that whole racist, to be a racist used to mean that you would openly say, that you felt that way.
You can't deny you're a race just because you don't use the N word in everyday speech or whatever. That's
Huh.
Any other thoughts then as we get through the first third of the book? And I like how the chapters build on each other so far, and look forward to discussion. Now the time of truth. Who's going to lead next month?
No eye contact.
Yeah, I want to see a volunteer. Yeah, with masks on, it's easier to just look at the eyes.
I'll do it.
All right. Thanks, Rob. All right. We've got our leader for chapters 4, 5, and 6. Then with that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Those opposed, nay. We are adjourned.
Aye.